Sorry, I ain't got no money, I'm not trying to be funny, but I left it all at home today. You can call me what you wanna, I ain't giving you $1.
Welcome to the Big and Tall Sports Podcast with your hosts, Pete Apostolopoulos and Alec Reid.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 5 of the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Alec and Pete with you as always, joined by our very special guest, CHL commentator, analyst from Sportsnet, Sam Cosentino. Sammy, how you doing today?
Yeah, everything's good. Getting ready to go. Looking forward to World Juniors. Looking forward to the second half here of the CHL season. So everything's going good for me.
You guys are where this weekend? Peterborough, correct, on Friday?
We are not this Friday, though. Our schedule has changed somewhat from the Friday night. So we're on the 15th in Peterborough and then on the 17th in Drummondville, Quebec.
Oh, right on. So you're doing a little traveling.
Yeah, that's kind of the way she goes. 60 teams across the CHL, so we got to try and get to see the cross-section of all three leagues, and you never know where you're going to be from one day to the next.
So we have the World Juniors coming up, and Canada announced their selection camp roster last week. Are there any surprises on the list, or is it kind of exactly what you expected it to be?
No, it was pretty close. I think there might have been one or two guys from a list that I had projected during our CIBC Canada-Russia series. I put out a list of the guys that I thought were going to make it. So from that, maybe a departure of two or three different players. But for the most part, the meat of it's pretty much how I projected things to be. With the expectation that there was not going to be any more guys past Dylan Strom that would be released from their National Hockey League team. And maybe the one small surprise was the fact that, two things I guess would have surprised me a little bit. First would be Adam Foote's son, Cal, because he grew up living in the States, has not lived in Canada long enough, and has not played in Canada long enough to be determined a Canadian citizen by hockey standards. So had he been accepted by the IIHF as a Canadian citizen for hockey purposes only, I think he's a dual citizen when it comes to his real citizenship. But had he been considered, then he would have been included on Canada's list, which to me was a bit of a surprise with him being such a young defenseman. And I guess the other thing is that they decided to go with 3 goaltenders this year, which is a little bit of a departure from the past couple of years when they brought 2 guys to camp. Last year, they brought 2 guys to camp. One of them, Mackenzie Blackwood, was suspended, but for all intents and purposes, the last 2 years, they brought 2 goalies and not really had any competition other than for the starting job. So they brought 3 this year. I think that was a wise move. But in terms of the basic core of the roster, not a ton of surprises there for them.
As far as Canada's concerned, Sam, there's sort of a culture, I guess, of, there's 2 things around Christmas time, and that's Christmas and Canada winning the World Juniors. And other than in 2015, we really haven't seen that since 2009, 2008. And they haven't even really medaled as much as we're used to. Do you think this is a result of a decline in Canadian players and Canadian skill, or just a general increase in skill level in the rest of the world?
No, you know what, Alec? I think there's a couple of different factors at play here. I think, first and foremost, you talk about the National Hockey League getting younger, and every country seems to be affected by their 18 and 19-year-old players playing in the National Hockey League. Canada seems to be the one most affected by it on a year-to-year basis. Now, you could make the argument this year that the Finns would be the most, depleted. When you talk about Patrick Laine and yes, they Puljujärvi, but the fact of the matter remains that Connor McDavid is technically still eligible to play for Canada. Not to mention Lawson Krause, Anthony Beauvillier, Travis Konechny, are a couple of guys that won't be available. So the NHL getting younger, I think, is one factor. I think the fact that other countries are a lot better in terms of their overall skill. We've seen a real resurgence in Finnish hockey of late. We've seen a resurgence in Swedish hockey. The Russian hockey's never gone away. There's they always seem to be in the mix for a gold medal. And then I look at Hockey Canada. I think Hockey Canada got a little bit complacent for a time, and once they realized that the rest of the world was catching up, started to go through some changes, but those changes weren't initiated until the rest of the world had caught up. So I think there was a little bit of Hockey Canada being behind. They've revamped the program of excellence here going back a couple of years ago, starting with the under-17s and moving forward. So in terms of roster composition, coaching, management team, when it comes to selecting the World Junior team, there's a few things that have changed now for Hockey Canada. And I think now they're just starting to get caught back up again. 2015 being a good example. 2016 wasn't a particularly strong year, but that included a lot of 1996 born players, and that really wasn't a strong year for anyone across the world, and particularly not a strong year of the 96 borns for Canada. So I think this year they're going to be in tough for a medal once again, just because of the guys that are in the National Hockey League. And, the 97 birth year, while it is a good year, unfortunately it might be too good with too many of those guys playing in the National Hockey League. So it's going to be a challenge, but I think, those three factors have been at play here to kind of take Canada out of the mix for being the cinch gold medal winner each and every year. Going back to, like you said, Alec, I think it was 2009 was the kind of the last time where that was happening on a regular basis.
Do you think that the last 2 years we've seen Canada dominate the CHL versus Russia series? Do you think that that'll play into kind of Canada rebuilding? Because last year they smoked them and this year they did it again.
Yeah, I thought last year, I think the reason last year was Russia admittedly didn't bring over a strong team last year, and the theory behind that was they felt that because the World Juniors was being played on international ice, that they didn't want to bring their top star players at the junior level age to come and play in rinks that would be smaller than what they were going to be participating at the World Juniors. Now this year was a little bit of a different story, where they did bring a stronger team, yet still got beat fairly handily, and I think travel had a lot to do with it. But I felt that the Russians gave a pretty good effort this year, but I don't know if that's a big gauge on where Canada is World Junior wise. The Russians could be tricky with what roster they bring over, and I think there's no question that you're going to see probably 8, maybe as many as 10 guys that played in that Canada-Russia series participate in Montreal and Toronto at the World Juniors, but the 8 or so guys, or the 8 or 10 guys that they left back, are pretty good players, and I think those are where the higher skill guys, they were left behind this time around. So it's really tough to get an indication from that series exactly how the world order is going to fall. But one thing is for certain, Canada's going to be a contender, Russia's going to be a contender, and when they face off this year, it's going to be a war like it always is. That's one of the games I'm looking forward to because of how familiar I'll be with some of the Russian players.
Obviously, you mentioned Russian players out. There's a big name, I guess, from Canada's perspective who didn't play in that series, and that's Nolan Patrick. Obviously, a guy who's projected to go potentially number 1 in the draft this year and still hasn't played since the 6th game of the season for the Brandon Wheat Kings. Is he a guy looking forward to the World Juniors? Is there any news on him coming back, or how will all of this injury affect him and affect his draft stock?
Yeah, it's problematic. There's no question about that. I mean, you have to go back to the 11th or 12th of October as to the last game that Nolan participated in. It seems to be an injury, one of those mysterious upper body injuries that no one can get quite a handle on. And the shroud of secrecy behind it has been even more amazing, that there's been no leaks as to the exact nature of the injury. That, to me, has been held down for a long time, a lot longer than I would have expected, especially with the amount of time missed to this point. Will it affect his draft status? I don't think so. Will it affect his ability to compete at the World Juniors? Very possibly. And, unless Hockey Canada is playing along and they truly know what's going on and don't want to say, when I spoke to the Hockey Canada brass at the selection camp announcement at the end of November, they were hopeful, but they were definitely not certain as to whether or not Nolan would be available for the camp. Now, the issue there is if a player is eligible to participate in the camp, meaning that he's playing in the CHL, and he doesn't attend that camp, then his spot won't be held. So he has to participate fully in the camp, which begins on the 10th of December, in order to be able to make that team. And I think that question still remains one to be answered, and his status remains uncertain. And I even think in Hockey Canada's eyes, they feel the same way. So it's definitely something worth monitoring. In the grand scheme of things, when it comes to affecting his draft status, we've seen a lot of players, Morgan Riley, Brett Connolly, they're two guys, a fairly recent vintage, who were injured for most of their draft seasons, yet still went very high in the first round. So I don't think it would have much of an impact on whether or not he goes, very early in the first round, and still will likely be the number one guy taken.
There are 5 returning players on Canada's roster invited back to the camp. Do you think that these 5 guys are going to be able to do some damage and get them into the medal count this year? Because like you said, there are a lot of guys in the NHL that could be playing for this team, and they're doing well enough in the NHL where they're not being sent back. So do you think that these 5 returning guys will be able to kind of fill the void of the guys that they've lost?
Well, you got some anchors. I mean, you got Thomas Chabot on the back end. You got Dylan Strome, up front. And I think those two guys are going to have a lot of say in the point production of Canada overall. So you've got anchors. I guess the one concern I'd have moving forward is that you don't have that returning guy coming back to play goal, which might be, a little problematic, because as much as some of these guys have played big games in the regular season with their club teams, they haven't quite faced the pressure and the antics that a World Junior Championship has to offer. So I do have some concerns there. But the group of 5 that you talk about that is returning is definitely strong enough to put Canada in contention. But I think that group of 5 has to perform to its maximum abilities, if you will, in order to be able to have Canada be in the mix for a medal.
Every year we sort of get sheltered off here in Canada from other teams, I guess, and their superstars. And last year was a great example with guys like Austin Matthews, Jesse Puljujärvi, and these big name guys. As a Canadian, is there any names that you could say to Canadian fans that, hey, you should watch out for these guys in the World Junior Tournament in other countries?
Yeah, Timothy Liljegren would be one of those guys. And the Swedes have about 3 or 4 different guys that are projected to go in the first round. It's tough to really make that proclamation right now, because these teams will have their camp. So while almost all of those guys that are rated to go in the first round in the NHL draft will be invited to camp, that list of actually who will make their respective countries' teams is a little bit slimmer than the prospective camp list. Very much the same way as what happens in Canada, where you're seeing some draft eligible guys, Nolan Patrick being one of them, with the opportunity to play, meaning they get invited to the camp, but not necessarily make the team. So the Finns have a couple guys, Swedes have a couple guys. Same things with the Russians. Sam Cosentino is a guy that, as of right now, his status is uncertain as to whether or not he'll make Russia's team. But if he does make Russia's team, he's projected top 10 pick. So there are definitely, those guys out there that would have that sort of impact. But Liljegren out of Sweden, Klim Kostin out of Russia would be 2 guys to definitely keep an eye on.
In the CHL, across all 3 leagues, there seems to be maybe 3-4 teams in each league who are really a cut above everybody else. Is it tough to compare these CHL teams and these CHL players to these European players who are playing in pro leagues over there since the time they were the same age?
Well, it can be, and I think that's a big reason why you see such a large percentage of CHL players, get drafted when it comes draft time, because the schedule that they play, the travel that they have is the closest assimilation that you can get. The practice schedule, the game schedule, the travel, the off-ice responsibilities are about as close to simulating what you get in the National Hockey League as any of the leagues. But when you get to Sweden, the issue is, sometimes, and I'll give you Sweden as an example, you're playing in the SHL, which is essentially the top league in Sweden, the Swedish Hockey League. And then you have the Allsvenskan, which is essentially their AHL league. And then you have an under-20 league, and then you have the under-18 league. So a player who's draft eligible can participate really on any of those 4 levels. And when you're participating at 4 different levels throughout the course of the season, or 3 of them, or even 2 of them, it really becomes a challenge, because how do you gauge the talent? How do you gauge a player when one day he's playing against an 18-year-old, and the next day he might be playing against a 35-year-old in the Swedish league, And a week after that, he might be competing against a 21-year-old hot prospect who hasn't quite made it to the Swedish Hockey League. So it definitely has its challenges. That's why a lot of situations, teams will have their European scouts, then they'll go from their European scouts to their crossover scouts, if you will, in terms of guys who might work in North America who cross over, and then you got your head scout and sometimes your general manager, depending on where you're picking. All of those guys getting various looks at players to make sure that they're not missing, any pieces of the puzzle. So it definitely has its challenges. I think the CHL, obviously because the talent level is one thing. I think the other issue that you have there when it comes to the CHL is what we talked about, the assimilation to the National Hockey League. Makes it a little bit easier to evaluate players. But I think those challenges definitely exist when it comes to European players and where they are and being able to kind of gauge them on a regular basis because of how much they bounce between leagues.
Sammy, it was a pleasure having you on. Thank you for coming on. Hopefully you'll get a lot of good coverage over the course of the rest of the season, and hopefully it'll be a good and exciting rest of the season for you covering the CHL games. You can catch Sammy on Sportsnet Friday nights, Thursday nights. The next game, as you mentioned at the beginning of the pod, December 15th, London at Peterborough, 7 p.m. on Sportsnet 360. Sammy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks, Alex. Take care, guys.
That's going to do it here for the first half of the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk more World Juniors.
Grips on your waist from way back way. You know that I don't play. Streets not safe, but I never run away, even when I'm away. OT, it's never much love when we go OT. I pray to make it back in one piece. I pray. That's why I need one night. Got a Hennessy in my hand. One more time before I go. Higher powers taking a hold of me. I need a one night. Got a Hennessy in my hand. One more time before I go. Higher powers taking a hold of me.
And we're back here at the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Pete and Alec with you. Big thanks to Sam Cosentino for coming on. We had a great discussion with him about the CHL and the World Juniors. Alec, podcast number 6, who do we got this week?
We have an NBA legend in Bill Russell.
What a block by Russell! What a block by Bill Russell on Chamberlain's dunk shot. Incredible!
Bill Russell, arguably the greatest Celtic of all time, without a doubt the greatest number 6 of all time, with 11 NBA championships and a 12-time All-Star.
Yeah, Bill Russell, one of the best, most dominating players in the history of basketball and, maybe any other sport. When you look at that run that the Celtics went on when he was there, it was truly remarkable. So let's have a little discussion here, Alec, because we were just talking, in between our break after talking with Sammy. And, one thing that came up between the two of us when we were talking about what we want to discuss on the show this week was, does anybody outside of Canada give a shit about this thing?
Yes and no. Okay, I think if you're a hockey fan, absolutely. And I know in the United States, anyone who's related to hockey or is a passionate hockey fan obviously cares. Okay, but the problem with the United States especially is hockey isn't the number one sport, and I think that's the big problem with this. I think if you're going to look just sheer passion for this tournament, I think Russia would be the greatest candidate, or Finland. Or I think when you go historically, Russia and the Soviet Union have always been competitors in this tournament and always had great games with Canada and have always been one of the better teams. And when you look at the fans, I think sheer fan support, you're getting the most support, obviously, from Canada, but then you're looking at Russia and then I'd say Finland, Sweden. And, dude, does anyone give a shit? Yes. Yes, I think they do, but not as much as Canada.
I think that, like we talked about with Sammy, there's so much going on with the CHL now. It's becoming a bigger and bigger thing every year where these small market CHL teams are getting, Friday night primetime TV games. We're going to watch London and Peterborough tonight. Or, he said he was going to do a Quebec Junior League game in a few weeks. And I really think that the media coverage, because hockey is Canada's number one sport, like every single person in Canada could probably tell you who Sidney Crosby is. Could every single person in America tell you who Sidney Crosby is? Probably not, right? And, I think that it's, especially for you and I, and especially for you growing up around the game so much with your dad playing in the NHL, I think that, like you said with Sammy, when it's Christmas time, it's, you do your Christmas thing on the 25th, and the 26th is the World Juniors. And I think that even in Canada, that has changed a little bit from when you and I were kids. Because I remember as kids growing up, I would watch every single Canada game, every single World Junior game I could with all my buddies. We'd get together and we'd hang out, and, we'd play road hockey, or we'd go to the pond and go skating, and then we'd go watch the Canada game at night. And I really think that the kids today and, don't really appreciate it as much as we did. And I hate to sound, I feel like an old man saying that, but, the coverage is right there. It's never gone. We've always had coverage of it. We've always had, known who all the players are by the end of the tournament. And I really think that the last couple of years, myself included, we haven't really paid that much attention. And I think it goes back to what you asked about Sammy about, hey, these guys haven't really went on a big run since we had those Crosby teams, the Stamkos teams, the John Tavares, they won 4 or 5 back to back, right? And that was right in our wheelhouse of watching hockey and getting into sports. And I think that, it's a bit of a shame that these kids today, you saw Connor McDavid a few years ago dominate the tournament. But, this year, the best player, the guy who's supposed to be number 1 in the draft, might not even play, right? And I really think that these kids and the people who watch these games don't really have the same level of passion or appreciation as they did, let's say 5-6 years ago.
I think that comes back down to winning, though, right? How many people, you can call them bandwagoners all you want, but how many people would tune in to watch the Canada final or bronze medal game every single year? Well, if Canada's not in that game, nobody wants, in Canada especially, wants to watch, was it Finland this year, right? Finland win the championship. Nobody wants to watch that. Everyone wants to watch Canada play in a meaningful game, whether it's at least bronze. I mean, this year they didn't even make it into the bronze medal game this past year. So everyone, we kind of got accustomed to Canada winning every year. It was World Juniors roll around, Canada wins. World Juniors roll around the next year, Canada wins, and everyone got invested in that. I don't have to watch the World Juniors until the finals, right? And now everyone is still kind of following that sort of idea, but now they're not making it anymore, right? And maybe that's the problem, is that with them not winning, people don't care because they're just so used to them winning before that why should they watch now, right? And I'm glad you brought up with the injuries and everything, because this tournament has now become, like Sam said, so much different because of the NHL getting younger. And now we're seeing a lot more guys in the junior leagues play in these tournaments, whereas before, we used to always laugh about Pierre Maguire, and he'd talk about, this guy who got drafted to this team in this round, and he's from this team, and blah, blah, blah. And he used to go off about how, all these players and where they were from and where they're drafted to. Well, now we have, maybe 5 guys each year that are drafted. The rest are junior guys, right? And so people were able to get invested in these skill guys, like when we had the big names, the Bergerons and these guys, the Phaneufs and the Crosbys, because they were already drafted, a lot of them, and they got to come back and play. And so a lot of these guys were so easy to invest yourself in because you could relate to them. Say a guy like a Bergeron, if I was a Boston fan, right? I could invest, say, oh, I'm a Boston fan. This guy's a Boston guy. I want to watch him. I want to see what he brings to the table on this world stage. Well, now we're getting these guys like younger guys that aren't drafted yet, like the Austin Matthews last year and now a bunch of guys this year, that it's hard to get really invested in them when you don't know if they're going to get drafted, where they're going to get drafted. So you don't really have a connection with them unless you follow them through their junior team.
Yeah, and again, I think that I love watching this tournament. I
do too. Same here.
And if you're someone who doesn't really follow junior hockey, like I'm not the biggest junior hockey guy, but for purpose of staying in touch with the future of the NHL or the future of hockey, I know who the main teams are. I know who the main players are, kind of the top 5-6 guys who to watch for, stuff like that. So would consider myself a casual fan. But if you look at guys like Jordan Eberle or the goalies that Canada's had, like guys like Scott Wedgwood, or even back when Carey Price, I always remember one of the best hockey games I've ever watched is that Canada versus USA shootout when Jonathan Taves kept shooting and Carey Price kept stopping. I think it was Patrick Kane. So things like that. And like you said, you might not be able to attach a player to a certain team yet. You can in some cases. We see guys like Dylan Strome from Arizona coming down, and Pierre-Luc Dubois. And, there's some guys who we've seen in the NHL or we know we can connect with an NHL team. Now, if you look at guys like, I'm going to use Jordan Eberle as an example because he scored that massive goal with, there was that commercial with Destiny Panics or whatever. This tournament, that guy was a stud. And then now in the NHL, he's kind of just, an okay player. But because we remember Jordan Eberle from being one of the best players we've ever watched in the World Juniors, we now see him in the NHL as always going to be this big superstar. He was like a 20th overall pick, 22nd overall pick, right? And I think that just as this tournament can have those surprise guys that we find and, oh, wow, like this guy, I never knew who this guy was. He can play. It can do some damage as well to that. Because like we just said, think about the expectations. If some guy on Canada scores 10 goals in 6 games and gets drafted in the top 5 picks, let's say it was Nolan Patrick this year. Let's say he comes back from his injury and he plays, he goes first overall to the Islanders or whatever crappy team gets him, Vegas maybe, right? And this guy comes out and just lights it up. Well, everybody in Canada who watches these games is going to know. And especially if you watch these games against the Americans or the Russians, because those seem to be the marquee matchups, I think that, you kind of gain the familiarity with the players. And I think that although the coverage has always been there, like I said, we've always had access to this tournament. We've always had the most coverage. I don't think that is the same in other places around the world. And for this personal tournament, I look at this a lot like I look at the CFL. It is what it is. The CFL is what it is. And people in Canada, some people don't like it. Some people, that's the only thing they'll watch. They won't watch the NFL or they won't watch college football. And that's fine. If the CFL's your thing, the CFL's your thing. And I really think the World Juniors is kind of the same thing. If you want to watch it and you love watching it, great. I'm going to get together with my buddies and watch Canada USA every single time. Every single time those two teams play in hockey, I'll be watching it. Whether it be the World Championships or the Olympics or the World Juniors. And I think, I know that they televise games on NHL Network for when the American team plays, but, how many people across the U.S. are going to watch a Canadian World Junior game when there's all those college football bowls that we just talked about on, right?
I think you hit it right on the head with that. The college football bowls take precedence to the World Juniors, especially in the States, and maybe even in Canada too. Now going forward, college football has really picked up, or maybe that's affecting a lot of the viewership for the World Juniors in Canada. And I think you're right. The Canada-US game is a classic that everyone wants to tune in and watch because every year it's going to be a good game, and we've kind of become accustomed to that philosophy. And hopefully now with the emergence of the World Cup of hockey this summer, seeing what all these new young talents can do, maybe that excitement to the World Juniors will come back if people see what these young guys can grow into.
Yeah, no doubt. And the one last point I want to make before we move on is if you look at the World Juniors and its success in terms of going to the arena, they like to keep it around Canada. And no doubt in my mind that the fans in Europe, when they had it in Finland or when they do it in Sweden, no doubt in my mind that those teams show up, but I really think it's on a whole new level when you put it in Buffalo or Toronto or anywhere else in Canada like we're going to see this year. And I really think that when those fans show up, it's really something special.
So make sure to, keep your eye on the World Juniors this year. I think it's going to be a great tournament. Hopefully we can see a Canada in the final again because, as we all know, there's nothing more exciting than Canada playing in the World Junior final. For right now, I want to bring up my favorite part of the show every week, again at the expense of my partner, Pete Apostolopoulos. It's Pete's Tweets time. So Pete tweeted this all out this morning, Monday morning. And how fun was it, Pete, this morning when he tweets out, "Who needs an alarm when you have drills and hammers firing on all cylinders in the condo above? Hashtag Pete's Tweets."
We finally, after weeks of this happening every once in a while, we came down to the conclusion, and it turns out that the noise was from a couple of doors down in the unit that my roommate's dad also owns that they're doing construction in. So it's
How often? How often did this happen?
Like they come like once every few weeks. But we've always thought that it was from above, but it was literally our own people making the noise.
Oh my God. So then just to add to the noise of the morning, condo fire alarms now beeping for regular testing. Are you kidding me? Hashtag Pete's Tweets. How was that waking up this morning?
Yeah, it was at like 10 o'clock. Let's get something. It wasn't like it was at like 6 o'clock in the morning, but...
I mean, were you awake at, 10 o'clock? Yeah, see? So you're waking up.
Yeah, the fire testing, and then you'll see the next tweet will tie into this, but they came in and they actually tested our fire alarm, and then the fire alarm went off for like 5 minutes. So it was just a huge pain in the ass.
So Pete then tweeted out, "They came to check our fire alarm, make sure it works. 0% chance my career could involve listening to fire alarms all day. Hashtag Pete's Tweets." And then you tweeted out, are we at the point where you can keep your phone on are we at the point yet where you can keep your phone on while on a plane? I feel like that should be a thing by now. Hashtag Pete's Tweets. I agree with that.
That was just a random thought.
It is a random thought. But that brings me to, this is awesome. The marshmallow to cereal ratio he tags it at Lucky Charms is appalling. Hashtag Pete's Tweets.
Absolutely pathetic.
So, and then on top of that, Pete gets a tweet from at Lucky Charms. "Sorry to hear that. Give us more info so we can report this and replace the box. Thank you." Are you kidding me? You got a response from Lucky Charms.
I'm not going to go through the trouble of replacing the box, but I just wanted them to know.
Well, it's nice of them to respond. So Lucky Charms, thank you. Follow Pete on Twitter at BigPete44. Follow me on Twitter at AlecReid14. I got Instagram, by the way. I haven't posted anything. What's your Instagram if you want to follow you?
My Instagram is La Pistola44.
La Pistola44. I think I'm Reader1436. I don't know. Let me check that. I honestly don't know. I haven't made a post. Yeah, Reader1436 if you want to follow me on Instagram. I already got 198 followers. Just putting that out there. Haven't made any posts. So I want to get, now we're going to transition into Pete's favorite time. You can hear him clapping. He is excited about this because we talked about a few weeks ago about how there might not be any baseball, but there's baseball. CBA is done, and it is time for the free agent frenzy. A couple of big signings happened. Earlier this morning, we had a signing for the Jays. Pete, you can talk more about that in a second, but a couple of big signings going elsewhere. Astros, the Yankees making moves. it is the excitement week for free agency in baseball. Pete, I know this is all you. I know you're fired up to talk about this. Let's go.
First of all, Alec, it's called hot stove season. in
I'm
baseball,
sorry. I'm
all right?
sorry.
Get it right.
I'm
no.
sorry.
Okay. So basically, here's where we're at in the baseball landscape right now. CBA's done. That's good. Okay. Basically, the winter meetings are going on starting today and going through Thursday, I believe. And it's just going to be a mess. We're talking about guys like Chris Sale being traded. We're talking about guys like Chris Archer being traded. Encarnacion still a free agent. Batista still a free agent. Mark Trumbo still a free agent. And really, it's going to be an extremely, extremely interesting week just because a lot of teams hesitated to make moves until the CBA was finalized so they could see what was going to happen regarding the rules, payrolls, etc. And now that that's all out of the way, it's right back to business. And like you said, Jays signed first baseman / outfield / utility infield / every position on the diamond. Guy Steve Pearce from the Baltimore Orioles and Tampa Bay Rays from last year. Kind of a low-key guy that not a lot of people know about, but he's a really good player. And like as I mentioned already, he plays every single position on the field. So I think that'll be a good signing. I mean, the only thing that would have made him an absolute perfect fit would be if he was left-handed, but good right-handed bat. He'll hit for average. He'll have a high on base. He actually had the second highest on base percentage from last year out of any other free agent aside from Edwin Encarnacion. So I think it was a good move. 12.5, reasonable number for 2 years, and hopefully there's some more stuff going on. I know a lot of Dexter Fowler talk going on, which would be nice. And, you know, with the Astros and Yankees signing Beltran and Matt Holliday, those guys really don't need Edwin Encarnacion anymore, don't really have the space for him anymore. So it's really interesting now to see where his market goes. And, you know, could an NL team come in and take him? Could a team like Seattle maybe want him? But the problem with teams like Seattle and Texas is, well, Seattle more so than Texas. Texas would be a good fit. But especially with Seattle, they could use the bat, but they already have Nelson Cruz, who's around the same age, and he's going to be DHing for the next few years. So, I don't know. There's a lot going on. Really interesting stuff.
I'm glad you brought up Edwin Encarnacion, because I'm sure for most Jays fans, the question is, oh, well, is there, you know, to quote Dumb and Dumber, so you're saying there's a chance he might come back to Toronto. But with this Steve Pearce deal, is there a chance anymore that Edwin comes back to Toronto? The door's still open. I've heard rumors that they're still in talks. I heard there was a big deal on the table. Actually, when I was driving in today, heard there were talks there was a big deal on the table, and then rumors that there wasn't a deal and that was just made up. But it's a lot going on. And you mentioned Dexter Fowler. Are the Jays better off with a guy like Dexter Fowler or going with a guy and spending the money to keep Edwin?
Okay, so just a recap now that I have the full list in front of me. My computer was not cooperating. So basically you had Cespedes, who was the best guy, and he re-signed with the Mets, which I think is great because if you looked a couple of years ago at how talented this guy was and how he bounced around from Oakland to Boston, to Detroit, back to the Mets, and then he was going to leave the Mets, and then he opted out this year after signing a contract last year. I think Cespedes staying in New York, good move, and now that creates a surplus of outfielders, especially left-handed outfielders, given that they have Conforto, Granderson, and Bruce all under contract. So definitely don't be surprised if Granderson or Bruce get traded. Toronto will definitely be in on that. The problem is so will teams like Baltimore and maybe the Yankees, depending on the price.
Don't ignore my question. Don't beat around the bush with my question. I asked you a question. Are they better to go after Dexter Fowler or spend the money on Edwin? Answer the question.
Well,
I want to know. I want to know. I know
Okay.
the people want to know. That's why I'm asking you. I want to know.
My ideal plan would have been sign Josh Reddick and sign Edwin Encarnacion. Because you get a left-handed bat who's can do some damage at the top of the lineup, and you get a plus outfielder. He's Jose Bautista with less home runs, but better outfielder.
But unfortunately for the Jays, they kind of signed their backup plan too early with Kendrys Morales, and, kind of, I don't want to, bring any bad terms in, but, jumped the gun a little bit and said, hey, we got to get this guy right now before anyone else snags him up. And they kind of screwed themselves as far as Edwin is concerned, because now they already got his replacement.
Okay. Edwin Encarnacion can play defense. If you need him to play defense for 2 years and maybe you pay him $25 million a year instead of $20 million a year the first 2 years, I would be okay with that. For him to play defense, and at the end of the day, Pierce plays anywhere. He's kind of your safety net. He played a lot of second base last year, and I think he can play some outfield, so that'll help out as well. I think what the Jays have shown us early with the Pierce and Morales is they're kind of expecting Edwin to sign elsewhere. However, I don't necessarily think that him coming back would necessarily be off the table. Look, we saw last year with guys like Desmond and Dexter Fowler signing well into the offseason, almost into spring training, especially Fowler turned down the qualifying offer and then signed a 1-year, $8 million deal. He gave up half the contract to re-sign with the Cubs. So would it surprise me if Edwin re-signed here? Not necessarily, but looking at the Texas Rangers right now, I could see that being a better overall fit for him, and I could see them offering more money than we will.
Okay, fair enough. But the Jays need some left-handed bats. I know we've stated this everyone's been stating this from day one. Okay, who's left? Because now we're almost past that point of, good left-handed bats still being out there. So if you can go through, give me one left-handed bat that actually fits their spot, because, shortstop, third base are already taken. You got your catcher, you got your center fielder, and Pilar is already there. What spots are even left to fill where you can put a good left-handed bat?
Well, you have the platoon of Carrera and Upton in the outfield, and I guess if you want to put Pierce in right field for right now, I don't know. Left-handed hitters, it's a bit of an overblown thing to a certain extent, but if you take a look at the way the lineup was last year, where we had one lefty and it was Saunders, who wasn't very good. I think that you definitely need that balance, and you need to have options, right? Morales, switch hitter. Even if he doesn't play every day, you have a guy who can come in and with one swing of the bat change the game from either side of the plate, right? And at the end of the day, it sounds like from what we've heard from John Gibbons, all he wants is some options in the bullpen, in the lineup, on the bench, because we had no bench last year, and our bullpen, aside from 3 guys, and 2 of them were 40, was not very good. And now the worst signing of the offseason by far has to be Brett Cecil, which, good for him, $30 million, but for the St. Louis Cardinals to give that guy that much money is absolutely ridiculous, and I don't blame him at all for taking it.
Okay, so I want to move on to something still baseball involved, and we can get back to this maybe at the end of the podcast. But it's something that happened yesterday. I'm not sure if you heard about this, but Bud Selig actually got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame as part of the, the Today Committee, the Today organization, but basically from 1988 onward. Okay? And I heard a lot of heat about this. Did you hear some of the heat that's coming on?
I was watching MLB Network when they announced it, and you know what? The guy was the commissioner for 25 years. He introduced this playoff, which I absolutely adore. And, if there's one thing, obviously I wasn't alive for 25 years, but I haven't been alive for 25 years, but if I think of one thing that has really changed baseball and gave it that kind of shot of adrenaline in the arm, it has to be the playoff. Has to be the playoff.
But the knock on Bud Selig was he was the commissioner during the steroid era, right? And so how are we going to allow, and maybe if you want to do a coin flip on this, how can he allow the major league players to, or how can we allow Bud Selig into the Hall of Fame and not allow the Barry Bondses in?
Well, I think part of putting Bud Selig in the Hall of Fame, in turn, we might get surprised this year. There are Manny, Vladdy Guerrero. There's one other guy. Hold on, let me look it up.
Bonds is still up though, right?
Bonds is still up. Jeff Bagwell. Piazza got in last year, and he
Yeah,
was
but that's no surprise though, because he didn't. His accomplishments weren't based off of steroids.
But he was a steroid. He had the most home runs in the history for all catchers.
Yeah, but people don't associate him with steroids like they do with Barry Bonds.
Oh, they
Well, okay, so let's do. Do you agree with me then that Bud Selig getting in should mean that guys like Barry Bonds should be allowed in the Hall of Fame?
I've been saying the whole time that this debate has gone on. Like, if I am ever fortunate enough to get a Hall of Fame vote, I'm voting for Alex Rodriguez. I'm voting for Barry Bonds. I'm voting for Manny Ramirez. Because you know what? Even if they weren't caught like those guys were, or admitted to it, or whatever you want to call it, for different guys, different cases, everybody was on something. Roger Clemens, Bonds, Sosa, McGuire, all these guys are Hall of Famers.
And I hate to ruin it for some people, but Hank Aaron admitted that he took steroids. Maybe not the same, performance enhancers that they had during Bonds' era, but he said he did it too. So let's get the coin out. If you got a coin or something, what do we flip? You got anything to flip? Okay, we got it here. So we're gonna flip this coins. Pudge
Rodriguez. Ivan
Go.
Rodriguez.
There's the other
third
one.
guy.
He's the other one I got. So we're gonna flip this. We'll go heads. You have to argue that these players do not belong in the Hall of Fame. We'll go Bonds, Rodriguez.
So you agree
Clemens.
with me that the steroid guys should get it?
Oh, 100% they should be.
Okay.
So now you got to heads. You got to argue. Tails. I got to argue. Come on.
Every time.
Ah, this sucks. Okay, so it's tails. Such a
Do you want me to
painful-
argue it?
No. I lost the toss. I got to do it. So, okay. Here's why these guys shouldn't be allowed in. From a baseball perspective, you are then promoting cheaters to be in your game. Okay? And that's like taking the Black Sox and throwing them into the Hall of Fame. Basically is what you're saying. Is we're going to allow these guys who quote unquote cheated to get themselves in the Hall of Fame and allow them in. Who cares if everyone was doing it? Right? Maybe if everyone was doing it, no one should be allowed in. And I think that's the stand that baseball and the Hall of Fame has taken, which if you're, agree or disagree, if that's their stand, then you got to respect that stand. Okay? And there's so many other cases of guys taking steroids in other sports and it tarnishing their record. But now, guys are getting 4-game suspensions for taking steroids, right? Before, especially in that era, you look at Barry Bonds when he was a base stealer in Pittsburgh, and look at him at the end of his career. It was obvious that guy was taking steroids, okay? And so for baseball to say, oh, yeah, we're going to let that guy into the Hall of Fame even though he took steroids, well, now what's that saying to the players of the league now that we're going to condone you using steroids and promoting that? Because that as soon as they let him in, it's now a promotion for them. Okay, we let Barry Bonds into the Hall of Fame. We let Alex Rodriguez into the Hall of Fame. That's a promotion. That's them saying we are promoting these guys as the best of all time, and we are putting them in our Hall of Fame.
Okay.
End point. Because I don't want to argue for that anymore.
Okay. Pete Rose, most hits in baseball history and MLB history, not in the Hall of Fame. Completely non-baseball related. They just don't want him in because they think he's a jerk. Barry Bonds, not in the Hall of Fame. Steroids. Never actually admitted to it. He's never been prosecuted, suspended, anything like that. There's just reports that he failed, and obviously there's the visual part of it. Roger Clemens, not in the Hall of Fame. Arguably the greatest pitcher of all time, the greatest pitcher of my generation, and probably the generation before me maybe. But regardless, never been admitted to it, never been prosecuted, charged, suspended, whatever. So we're talking about the guy who has the most hits, the guy who has the most home runs, and the best pitcher of all time are not in the Hall of Fame? How is that possible? How is that a thing?
I honestly, I don't know. And I am mad I lost this coin toss. I'll let you continue to argue since you won the coin toss.
I think, I mean, I don't know what else to say. You have the three greatest players in their respective components of the game, in the three biggest parts of the games, the home runs, the hits, and the pitching. Pitching overall, Clemens and Nolan, you could probably put Clemens and Nolan Ryan 1A, 1B. But
Different eras.
But how do you not have three of the most important, if not the most important, figures in your sports history not in the Hall of Fame? What kind of Hall of Fame is it?
Especially going back to when we were growing up as kids, and maybe a little before us as well, you have Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds. That was baseball. Those three guys crushing bombs. You know, how many that Bonds put into McCovey Cove, and watching, you know, Sammy Sosa hit home runs like 600 feet that they said they would have landed. Stuff like that. You know, those are icons of baseball. Those three guys, you said Clemens, Pete Rose, and Barry Bonds, are icons of baseball.
Like, if there's a Mount Rushmore for players, those guys are right at the top of the list of these are three of the four guys on this.
Yeah, I think you go maybe Barry Bonds. You got to have Babe Ruth. I'd argue Pete Rose. And I don't know about Nolan Ryan or Sandy Koufax. You know, if we'll go modern day baseball.
The point is, they're really good and they're really important, and they should be in the Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
And if you're looking at the ballot, so this year, because it'll come out, we'll do a thing on it in January when next semester hits. January 16th, they're releasing the 2017 Hall of Famers. And you have Pudge, Manny, Vladimir Guerrero, Jorge Posada, Maglio Ordonez, and that's pretty much it from the new guys. Those are kind of the guys who will get some votes. I don't think anybody else will get enough votes to stay on. Maybe Maglio Ordonez and Posada might stick around, but they'll get a few votes. I don't know if they'll get enough to stay on. But if you look at from the last few years, I think that Trevor Hoffman needs to go in the Hall of Fame this year. If not this year, he better get in next year, because how are you not going to get him in? This is his second ballot. He had 70% last, or 67% last year. You need 75 to get in, I believe. So, first of all, how do you not have that guy in first ballot? And last year you could have put him in, I think. Then you also have Jeff Bagwell, who's on his 7th year now, who had 71% last year. So he's most likely going to keep increasing. And if he's not in this year, it'll be next year. And then it's kind of, you know, Schilling, Clemens, Bonds, Edgar Martinez, who should be in the Hall of Fame, I think, too, as a DH. There's some interesting guys there. You know, you look at guys like Gary Sheffield, Billy Wagner, Sammy Sosa. You know, there's some intriguing names. And again, it comes down to, like, if steroids weren't a thing in baseball and nobody ever found out that guys use steroids and nobody would ever, I guarantee you every single player today would be using them still. Right? Because at the end of the day, they're professional athletes and they want to win and they want to get paid. And they want to use any advantage they can get. And a lot of these guys, especially if you look at Latin players, from where they come from and what they are given in the big leagues and the opportunities that they're given, they want to use it as much as they can. They want to take as much out of their career as they can. And that goes for not just Latin players, but for everybody. But in particular, if you look at a guy like Sammy Sosa. So with that said, I think that if you're Barry Bonds or Pete Rose or, by the way, Pete Rose, really quick before I wrap this up, I feel like one of these days, Pete Rose will never do it himself because I don't think he is that kind of person, because I don't really think he's a very good person. But I will say I do like him as an analyst, and I do think that he's one of the best hitters, if not the best hitter of all time. But I think literally all it would take for Pete Rose to get into the Hall of Fame is for him to come out and say, look, I gambled on the games. I'm sorry for it.
Absolutely.
If he did that,
that's all the MLB wants, is for him to just admit that he did it and say, I'm sorry. That's it. But I'm sort of on his, I don't want to say on his side, but he should be in regardless. And he's never going to come out and say that himself. But he should be in regardless. And the MLB is going to take a stand and say you're sorry. It's like a little kid. Oh, say you're sorry or you can't have this.
Well, I think the other thing is, too, is if you look at, I believe it was Giamatti was the commissioner at the time. Fun fact, Paul Giamatti's dad, the actor, his dad was the commissioner of baseball. Fun fact. He was the one who kicked Pete Rose out of baseball. And I really think that, I don't want to say it was an overreaction, but I feel like we're having a different conversation about Pete Rose, and we have a different perception of Pete Rose. If he maybe doesn't get a lifetime ban from baseball, maybe just gets, you're not allowed to work as a manager anymore, or you're not allowed to be a coach for the next, or there's some sort of 10 years, 15 years probation kind of thing. And I feel like if that situation was handled a lot differently, we could be having a very different conversation about Pete Rose today. And you know what? He very well might be living in Las Vegas selling $300 autographs to people. He very well could still be doing that. But I think he would have a Hall of Fame ring on his finger if the situation was handled a little differently.
So unfortunately, that's going to wrap it up here, episode number 6 of the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Happy to get both these out in the same day. Big thanks to Sam Cosentino for joining us and talking about the World Juniors. We had a great time, a great conversation with him. Keep around for the next couple of weeks. We got a couple of exciting exam week fun things that we're going to do coming up in the podcast. So if you got a little stress buster, we might have one coming out for you next week. That's going to do it for us. We got always have fun here on the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed. For Pete, I'm Alec, and we will see you next time.